Welcome to the panel, Queering Infrastructure, the System Through the Erotic. The panelists are Antonia Hernandez, Kathy Hai, Joel Ong, and myself, Stephanie Rothenberg. The panel is inspired by the work of queer scholar Audrey Lorde and her seminal essay, The Uses of the Erotic. The Erotic is Power, which was written in 1978. Lorde self-describes, and I quote, as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. And in the essay, she challenges the patriarchal overtones of the cultural use of the word erotic. She not only redefines, but reignites the erotic as a power of feeling, a physical, psychic, and emotional energy that can't be reduced to a commodified good or systematized affect. And in our current zeitgeist of neoliberal and recolonizing regimes, especially now that we're confronted with the limitations of the pandemic social distancing, the use of the erotic as a vehicle for understanding and as a means of empowerment is reemerging. Conjoined with the tactics of queering networks, power is being reclaimed through more sentient experiences and actions that disrupt hegemonic narratives and engage a broader spectrum of bodies. The invisible is becoming more perceptible through subtle shifts in knowledge production that embrace intuitive modes of learning. British artist Rachal Bradley calls for, and I quote, an erotics of infrastructure as a way to explore how the pleasurable, the charged, and the circuitous might recalibrate infrastructure from a non-neutral to a negotiable framework underlying our perception and our behavior in manifold ways. This panel questions what a politics of sentience might look like as it examines how the erotic as a queer method can be used to reimagine systems, networks, and infrastructures as agential and embodied spaces. The topics will include queering the atmosphere, money as a sensory device, laughter through multi-species communication, and how aphrodisia can disrupt global machines. Before we begin, I'm going to give a brief overview of each of the panelists. Antonia Hernandez is a Montreal-based Chilean media artist. She received her PhD in communications at Concordia University. Her practice mixes media and theoretical investigations, and her recent work explores maintenance activities and the circulation of money on digital platforms. Kathy Hai is an interdisciplinary artist working with technology, art, and biology. She collaborates with scientists and artists and considers living and dying systems, empathy, animal sentience, and the social, political, and ethical dilemmas of biotechnology and surrounding industries. She's received awards from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for Arts. Her works have been shown at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, Mass MoCA in North Adams, the Science Gallery in Dublin, among many more. She's had residencies at Symbiotica and the Finnish Society of Bioart and the Coalesce Center for Biological Arts at the University of Buffalo. She's a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, and she runs a laboratory in the Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies. Joel Ong is an assistant professor in computational arts and director of Sensorium, the Center for Digital Art and Technology at York University in Toronto, Canada. He's an artistic member of the UCLA Art Sci Collective, and his media art involves artistic and scientific perspectives of the environment, expressed through sound, video, and interactive elements. He works both individually and collaboratively with scientists in environmental studies, microbiology, and data aesthetics, and his installations and research projects have been shown and presented at various venues around the world. And lastly, myself, I am an associate professor in the Department of Art at the University of Buffalo, New York. And I have an interdisciplinary art practice that draws from digital culture, science, and economics. And I'm interested in exploring relationships between human designed social systems and biological ecosystems. I've exhibited in the US and internationally in spaces including IBEAM in New York City, the Sundance Film Festival, Laboral, Transmedial, and ZKM Center for Art and Media. Some of my awards include the Harpo Foundation and Creative Capital, and I recently did residencies at ZKU in Berlin and TOKAS, the Tokyo Art in Space in Tokyo. And in case you're wondering, the image behind me is from artist John Jennings.
Hello, I'm Antonia Hernandez, a Chilean artisan researcher based in Montreal and just graduated from a PhD in communication at Concordia University. So this is my presentation. So this short presentation will explain the erotic methodology I developed to explore the interplay between money and work on a sex scam platform. It is a complement to some of the findings on money outlined in the written component of this work. I was researching the American sex scam platform Chaine1, where people can broadcast sexual performances and sometimes receive money in exchange. Indeed, on the platform there are not regular payments but voluntary donations as tips that use a made-up currency. Despite the sexual character of the performances and the explicit advertisement, sex work as the platform's main activity is never named or acknowledged there. This sex scam platform can be better understood as a machine of social reproduction, when people can find not only sexual activity but company and attention. The platform accelerates these exchanges and capitalizes on them. This machine is ruled under what we could call a domestic episteme. As such, channels on the platform are called rooms and present as domestic spaces. Performers do not ask for money and clearly state that, rather than working, they're having fun. The platform, in any case, keeps half of the exchange money. So this is, in rough terms, the context of this investigation. I was pursuing a double task: to learn about the work of sex on the platform and about the sex of work. While I had a theoretical toolbox for interrogating the work of sex there, I realized that I was less prepared for exploring the sex of work. Indeed, this reproductive machine also produces an accelerated togetherness, and in this togetherness, people share their time with strangers, discuss movies, trade recipes, have sex. For exploring this aspect, I aim to develop an erotic methodology in a broad sense that could open up novel ways of engagement, and I'm gonna describe it. Instead of trying to disentangle the overlap between sex, eroticism, and play, I made use of it. For doing this, I set up an interpretation of the platform elements I was going to explore as my stage and research device. As in a misunderstanding, the room of the platform became a miniaturized one. The performer was someone who does performance. I establish a schedule and start broadcasting there, mixing maintenance action with playful erotic ones and engaging in this way with the different poles of activity of the platform. It was not, however, a solitary play, but an open field for the communication with the audience. Not having a good time. Useful, right? Can I switch out the electric? As Susanna Passonen says, a focus on play makes it possible to highlight improvisation driven by curiosity, desire for variation, and openness towards surprise. As a method and a disposition, playfulness allows the recognition of things that change, including bodies and structures. A flexible understanding of erotic play involved the embodiment of the research I was up to. While stressing curiosity and improvisation, play is not necessarily amusing. As such, there was humor in this approach, but never derision. The miniaturized room allowed me to combine theory with a concrete and personal account. The dollhouse, but more exactly my engagement with the platform through it was my way to do so. As Audrey Lorde says, the erotic is not a question only of what we do, it is a question of how accurately and fully we can feel in the doing. If I was trying to understand a sex cam platform through a dollhouse, I would have to play, and it was precisely that recognition what clarified the interlock between the different areas and questions of my research. It was through this erotic methodology that money on the platform, for example, could be explored both as an abstract tool for oppression and a material vehicle for communication. Both the sex of work and the work of sex were uncertain things, open questions. This erotic methodology allowed to inhabit that uncertainty. It was then about the eros of understanding.
Hello, my name is Kathy High, and I am an interdisciplinary artist and the head of our arts department at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I'm a faculty member as well. The name of my talk today is Subtle Sounds, Queer Laughter, and as you might be able to tell from the image here, this talk will be about my work with laboratory rats. I'm going to go back to a project that many of you may be familiar with, but this is something that I did about 15 years ago. It was an installation called Embracing Animal in the Becoming Animal exhibition. And here I was interested in working with transgenic rats that had been used for research for autoimmune patients. So these rats had been infused with human DNA mixed with their own to make them sick. So they developed symptoms and diseases much like rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease. And so these were diseases that are much like my own. So it was a way for me to look in kind of a reverse engineered manner into how these rats are being utilized within science for medical research, pharmaceutical research to develop medicines. This relationship I had with the rats made me think of this quote from Donna Haraway where she speaks of the oncomouse, the cancer-producing mouse, as her sibling or her sister. So these rats became a kind of kin to me, and I respected them greatly. But let's not forget that these rats are trans animals. They're workhorse products for science. They are the invisible workers on whose backs we have our medicines and our healthcare system is developed. Their names were Echo and Flowers in the first iteration, and Matilda, Tara, and Star. I worked in Symbiotica, the famous art and science residency at the University of Western Australia in Perth. There I was able to work with a scientist who was doing research on spinal injuries and working with stem cell therapies to try and heal these injuries. They were using rats as the subjects for their research. I was able to follow these surgeries and do drawings of the rats as they were participating in that. And it made me think of this other quote by Donna Haraway where she refers to animals living in a laboratory, such as Oncomouse, as a kind of vampire subsiding in the realms of the undead. These animals are in a kind of liminal state where they can't leave the lab, and their life is sort of sustained only through that scientific work. These are the rats greeting us as we came into the laboratory. And one of the things I learned while working with them was that they have a whole range of communication that is in the ultrasonic realm. Our hearing goes to about 20 kilohertz, and this is from about 20 to 100 plus in terms of ways that they signal each other that's beyond what we can actually hear with our human ears. And I learned that they also participate in something such as laughter, and this has been recorded over and over again in experiments. Jake Pansep was one of the scientists who recorded this laughter, and here's an excerpt from his research.
As we have listened to animals playing, we have heard what appeared to be the sounds of laughter. And we studied these for a couple of years without quite understanding that this might be laughter. And then one day we decided to tickle some animals. And we realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained these transducers that are called bat detectors, and that can bring very high frequencies down to our auditory range. And when we did this and we listened in, we could tickle animals and generate a lot of vocal activity that appeared to be laughter. And when we tested these animals to ask whether they were enjoying this kind of activity, the unambiguous answer was yes.
Dr. Jake Pansep, who was a neuroscientist very interested in affect and behavior, passed away sadly in 2017. Here's a quote from him about his research. Having just concluded perhaps the first formal, i.e. well-controlled, ethological analysis of rough and tumble play in the human species in the late 1990s, where laughter was an abundant response, I had the insight, perhaps delusion, that our 50 kilohertz chirping response in playing rats might have some ancestral relationship to human laughter. In fact, he likens it to infantile human hedonic laughter. So I had obtained these bat detectors and started working with a variety of rats, trying to record them. One of my colleagues, Eben Kirksey and Multispecies Salon, helped me by giving me audiences, and we contacted rat fanciers and tried to listen to these rats when they were giggling. Another collaborator of mine is Michelle Temple, who's a sound artist and also a PhD student in our arts department at RPI. She's been very interested in ultrasonics in general. She said this work in ultrasonics also draws attention to noise pollution and the decline of oral health in both animals and humans. Think of the purported accusations of ultrasonic warfare against U.S. diplomats in Cuba. Although humans don't experience ultrasonic frequencies through our physical state of hearing, which generally has a threshold of 20 kilohertz, we are sensitive to sound beyond our physical hearing. So someone who also took up the same interest in hearing beyond what you can actually hear with your ears was the famous electronic musician Pauline Oliveras, who would work with signal generators and then produce sounds beyond the range of human hearing to make electronic music from amplified combined tones. So Doug Kahn goes on to talk about Oliveras' work and her research in the theories of quantum listening, where she basically used tones below and above the audible range to produce tones within the audible range, paralleled the transduction in kind between acoustics and unheard electromagnetism. So this was something that Oliveras studied quite a bit in her deep listening and other practices. Pauline was very interested in these kinds of other ways of understanding sound beyond our hearing. And so this is where her work had taken her for many years. Michelle and I started to go to different friends' houses where we were recording with our bat detectors their pet rats and trying to see if we could hear their laughter. After about 3 years, we had recorded all of about 4 seconds of the ultrasonic giggle from rats, which is kind of frustrating. Luckily, last summer we had a breakthrough where Jeffrey Bergdorf, who was a colleague of Panksepp's, very generously offered us audio files from his work with rats. So he gave us ultrasonic giggles that he had recorded in the lab, many files of them. The team that I worked with was able to begin to unpack these recordings, clean them up, and find the giggle moments and layer them so that we created what I had ideally wanted to do originally with this project, which was a rat laughter chorus, a kind of layering of all these laughs, much like if you were sitting in a movie theater and you hear everybody in the theater laugh at once. So Michelle Temple and Matt Wellens were two of the people who worked very closely with me on this project, as well as Eric Rosenthal, an engineer. And we were able to release this project for the first time last year at the Impact Festival in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And so this was the first time we were able to play with this. What we were able to do was to finally get a hold of a speaker that could play the ultrasonic electronics of the rat laughter chorus. And then we were able to downsample it so that people could hear it. And here's an example of that, which I'll play for you. We have to keep in mind that this project was developed for the rats, not for humans. And ultimately, we hope I will be able to play this for lab rats in the very near future. This secondary and most important part of the research was cut off due to COVID. And so this research will continue as soon as we can get back in the labs. Myself and our rats. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joel Ong, and this is my paper entitled Aeolian Borders, Queering the Atmosphere. From the High Regions, the memoirs of James Glacier entitled Travels in the Air, published in 1871. Above the clouds, the balloon occupies the center of a vast hollow sphere. No isolated clouds hover above this plane. We seem to be citizens of the sky, separated from the earth by a barrier which seems impassable. We are free from all apprehensions, such as may exist when nothing separates us from the earth. We can suppose the laws of gravitation are for a time suspended, and in the upper world, to which we seem now to belong, the silence and quiet are so intense that peace and calm seem to reign alone. End quote. From the invention of the telescope to the wonders of levitation and flight, to the conquest of the highest peaks and today the highest penthouses, we've always seen the vertical as progress. Gaston Bachelard, in his book Air and Dreams, comments on this vertical differential by saying, vertical valorization is so essential, so sure, its superiority so indisputable that the mind cannot turn away from it once it has recognized its immediate and direct meaning. It is impossible to express moral values without reference to the vertical axis. We have been taught that ascent should be associated with the celestial and the positive valence, and that descent implies a journey downward, a fall, or a demise. Instead of these polemic association, Bachelard urges us to think through a multiplicity of metaphors. For instance, to examine the notion of ascent through the dialectical play of vertigo and victory. To balance these metaphors is to experience the discomfort of flight, along with the love of travel, is to be inspired by floating utopias, balloons, and terraforming in the air, but to remember the way the atmosphere has been zoned, instrumentalized, and militarized. It is to think of the paradoxes in the way we live in our insulated bubbles, air-conditioned bubbles, while sharing our lives, bodily fluids, microbiomes, across a commonwealth of air and breath. It is to think of the air as a never-ending historian and archive of our telematic expressions of love that levitate across continents, as Charles Babbage once wrote, and to recognize the same way that the air suspends and perpetuates the cries of protests in the streets, in detention camps, at border crossings, in domestic spaces, etc. To queer the atmosphere is first to realize the extent to which the air is gendered. Peter Adley, in his book simply titled Air, speaks of the gendering of air common within a much longer cultural history of the senses. Men were more associated with the rational world of sight, and women were understood to have a far greater sensibility of touch, smell, and taste. The smell of a particular room, the feel of humidity, etc. But the air defies static description. Just as turbulence spills a volatile mixture of air and fluid, cultural tornadoes, such as the one we live in today, effect a whirlwind in which the rational and the sensory are tossed together and rendered indistinguishable and incomprehensible. A planetary lobotomy, if you will. Just this year, we have received word that $4 million in funding has been awarded to the Chemical Sciences Division of NOAA's Earth System Research Laboratory to inject sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to seed clouds and shade the Earth from intense sunlight. Dubbed the Plan B for climate change by principal investigator David Fahey, geo-interventions such as these experiment with and manipulate the organic and inorganic compositions of the air. It would seem that this is a continuation of a historical masculine desire for dominion over the environment, but in this age of such severe anthropogenic imbalances, we require an equal measure of remediation. After all, the IPCC identified 204 scenarios in 2014 to meet climate goals, and in 184 of them, extensive amounts of climate modification would be required. According to Christopher Preston, we have entered the age of the Plastocene in the way that malleability and plasticity have become qualities of our everyday life, its impacts reaching well into the metabolic systems of the environment. What is truly worrying about these propositions is that these world-shaping decisions might not be made democratically, and that we have entered the age in which individuals, quote, rich white dudes, take matters into their own hands in an attempt to solve the climate crisis themselves. So there is a clear need for anticipatory policy, risk assessment, and codes of ethics on a global scale. Catherine Malibu warns us that plasticity affords us the mobility of form and function, but also includes in its transactions the potential for complete annihilation. This is particularly sobering when we remember the largest failed experiments of the Anthropocene: nuclear fallout, DDT, CFCs, Trump, just to name a few. In fact, the COVID-19 crisis has done more than any of these, I think, to remind us on an individual level of intimacy how fragile the composition of air is and how easily it may switch from freedom to precarity. To queer the atmosphere, then, is to intervene in these largely gendered discourses of control and to amplify voices of atmospheric sensitivity that have been silenced through the veil of climate politics. And perhaps we could approach the environmental from a position of strangeness, as described by queer theorist Sarah Ahmed. By encouraging the awkwardness of deviant technologies, she proposes in her seminal book Queer Phenomenology models of instability as the way of engaging with a largely unpredictable and non-heterogeneous world. One might also think about sensory ethnographic approaches to the atmosphere, breathing, feeling through an innate sensorium that invites an intersubjectivity, affect, art into the geopolitical debate. One might think of beating them at their own game in alternative solutions to aerial interventions by deviating from conventional environmental sensing strategies and envisioning strange or unexpected encounters with and within the atmosphere. For this, I offer Carolina Sobecka's works that suspend artificial cloud machines in the air, or Jennifer Gabra's forecast factories that ornament geoengineering technologies such as rockets and cloud seeding devices and snow globes. After all, eco-politics and eco-poetry are enmeshed in a shared trajectory. In doing so, these aesthetic agencies come together to challenge the debate with infinite potentials of radical alterity. Bachelard speaks of descent as a form of inverted ascent, to imagine rise and fall as a continuum. I wonder sometimes about the greed machine that will kick in once these technologies and experiments are underway. Even the most steadfast of proponents of climate engineering, Harvard scientist David Keith, has expressed his apprehensions of the way these affordances may be repurposed inappropriately in the long term. I quote, "Human desire expands like a gas to fill the bottle defined by resources and technology." I think this is the most culturally appropriate phrase I know today. In closing, I'll say a descent is not a fall. Stopping is not a kind of death, and pausing is not a moment wasted. And perhaps this time will allow us to look not so much to technocratic exit strategies, but instead of a way of learning to live within the ruins, in the words of Anna Singh. After all, the wilderness is already gone. There is space now only for healing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Rothenberg, and I'm going to be talking about my project Aphrodisia and the science of Sentience 2.0. So I'm wondering, how many of you out there in the physical world eat oysters? And how does it make you feel? Does anyone experience what is known as aphrodisia? A positive, energized sensation throughout your body, often directed at others. And what if you were able to project that energized sensation towards a larger goal, outside yourself? Maybe even to eradicate the causes of the Anthropocene and thus prevent more coronaviruses. You see, those succulent little organisms that slippery slide down your throat so smoothly with the sip of vintage Chardonnay are magical creatures. But are oysters really aphrodisiacs? Let's take a look at the science. Oysters are filter feeders. An adult oyster can filter as much as 50 gallons of polluted water per day. That's more than your $300 Berkey filter can do per day. And their sturdy shells of calcium carbonate form natural seawalls to protect us pesky humans against sea levels rising. And they're a great source of protein. 3-ounce serving equals 8 grams. Now, back in 2005, a team of researchers conducted a study on whether oysters actually induce a state of aphrodisia in humans or if it is just a myth. Although there were some gaps in the study, it was concluded that oysters, part of the bivalve mollusk family, such as clams and mussels, produce an amino acid called D-aspartate. And when injected into laboratory rats, sorry Kathy, it caused the animals to overproduce sexual hormones, testosterone and estrogen. So does it induce aphrodisia in humans and possibly other species? The ability to increase testosterone levels has made it very popular in sports training products that affect body muscle performance. But in more broad-based research, it's revealed that D-aspartate has much wider effects on the body than just bodybuilding. It is found in high concentration in the pineal gland, it affects women's hormones and their ovaries, and it also modulates melatonin synthesis. So what if oysters could be genetically modified to leverage the effects of D-aspartate into a special formula? A drinkable juice that could push aphrodisia beyond the mere sensations of sexual desire into a more fully awakened state of perception towards oneself and others, as Audrey Lorde would call it, an eroticism of power? Or in this case, Aphrodisia, a sentience 2.0? Much innovation has emerged in the industry of aquaculture, a contemporary form of sea farming, as a way to offset the devastating environmental impact of land-based farming. Shellfish, specifically oysters, have become a top commodity because they're not only a food source, but also, as mentioned, able to filter polluted water and create natural seawalls. Oysters contribute to the surrounding ecosystem versus depleting it. Therefore, we could say that oysters are already helping to cure climate change. Now, what if humans could cure climate change? Let's quickly take a look at this model. Ecosystem services are defined as the goods and services that nature provides humans, such as food and fresh water. It's the way a value is placed on nature. Nature becomes quantified and is not just nature anymore, but natural capital. Oysters are natural capital assets. As the management school saying goes, what you do not measure, you do not manage. But apparently this model is not working too well. So what if we introduce humans into this equation as natural capital assets? In strategic sites located near municipal public water drinking reservoirs, a new breed of oyster is being bioengineered. It will produce a special juice that induces a state of aphrodisia when ingested in humans and possibly other species. Access to the juice is as easy as turning on your faucet. Now everyone can achieve aphrodisia. Eradicating the Anthropocene has never been easier. We're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's panel, Queering Infrastructure, the System Through the Erotic. I'm thrilled to be here with some of my favorite cohorts. Before I do introductions, I just want to thank ISEA for the incredible job that they've done transitioning this conference to a virtual platform. I think it's been really great, and I want to say I feel like I'm here. So thank you so much. So I'm Stephanie Rothenberg, and I'm going to be kind of moderating the panel. We don't have an official moderator, and we're going to try to make it more of a group discussion. And what I'll do, since you already got an introduction at the beginning of the presentations, is just briefly introduce everyone. So I'm Stephanie Rothenberg, and I'm based in Buffalo, New York, at the University of Buffalo. And we also have on our panel Kathy High, who is a professor in arts at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, based in Troy, New York. And we have Antonia Hernandez, who is a Montreal-based Chilean media artist. And we have Jill Ong, who is assistant professor in computational arts and director of the Sensorium, the Center for Digital Art and Technology at York University in Toronto. So we're actually not that far away from each other. So I'm going to just start with a general question, something that I've been thinking about just to get things going, and hopefully everybody will contribute some questions. But in just thinking about the title of this panel, right, Queering Infrastructure, and I think all of the artists, all of their projects, have a really interesting way of really, if you think about the term queering, of really opening up these capitalist, hegemonic, oppressive systems, and creating more inclusive, non-normative narratives. And everybody uses these very unique ways to destabilize these systems. We see the way that we're put in these kind of disoriented positions. I'm thinking about Joel's video that I ended up watching again last night while I was eating dinner. And you get this like dizzying effect. You're disembodied. It takes you up where you're looking down. thinking about Kathy, right, and her rats and this non-human way of seeing the world. She talks about these rats as these invisible workers, but the soundscape that she creates is both made for and by the rats. And Antonia with the dollhouse, right, this miniaturization and representation, and then also getting into this sexual play and this interesting space of leisure and labor. And then also with my project, which is, I guess you could say like recreational drugs, but ingesting this aphrodisiac to take you into this different space. So I guess my first question for everyone is if you could talk a little bit about creative strategies for destabilizing these systems and how both your own creative practice and anything else you want to address within that really kind of performs that.
Who wants to go first?
How about you?
Okay. In my case, it's very literal what I did. That is something that I really enjoy, doing things very literal as a way to both disrupting and also understanding. There was a question about like if the approach was ironic, and it's not really ironic for me in the sense of there's no derision. I'm not trying to mock the thing. My concrete problem was like I was doing this research on shadow bait and sex scams, and I had I have the guilt of not being a sexual performer myself, and also and also like being an outsider, and like and understanding that I was missing a big part of the equation for not like enjoying it and only like approaching from I don't think it's fair to say like a critical perspective, but like in a literal sense. So when I understood my role as like a series of interventions, that's where I could like relax and approach from like a more playful way, and understand that yes, there's a lot of things that are happening that are like exploitation, extraction, etc. But I'm not being able to understand the complexity if I'm not participate. So that's where the erotic and the playful, and I don't think it's important to disentangle those concepts, plays such a role, because the play is disruptive. It gives place to contamination, to encounter, to be and I'm quoting like Anna Sink, and this idea of like precarity as being vulnerable to others. So how we can approach like this is a very precarious labor, but how that can be like destabilize categories, encounters, things, and being open to more to the complexity of what was happening. So yeah.
I could go next. Thanks, Antonia. For me, I think I'm approaching this topic one from like a very kind of maybe historically already prevalent practice of rendering technologies strange. So in that way, there's this destabilization already happening. But I think, I'm also interested in the notion of human desire. I think in today's kind of embroiled within today's environmental politics, and in particular, I've been really interested in the air. like in the past, we've, I've been doing visualizations and sonifications of the wind. Like a lot of it's a very passive process of listening into what's going on. But then when you read deeper into it, you realize that it's actually being actively manipulated. As I mentioned in the talk, it's the idea of correcting, so-called subjecting this to a correctness of technology, that you're altering the metabolisms of this planetary system, right? And so, for me, I'm approaching it from a point that humanity is always about, or we're always interested in the extraction of value. David Keith talks about the technology as a kind of, vessel that it. Okay, let me get the quote and then I'll put it up later. It's not on my mind right now. But the whole point is that, how can we subvert this idea, this extraction of value, right? And to think about desire not so much as a symptom of a lack, right? As maybe Deleuze has talked about, it's a lack and therefore there's a fear of losing something and therefore you desire something very much, right? And then, and to see it from another standpoint, which is, a motivation towards something, possibly the erotic, yeah. So I'll just leave it as that for now and find the quote.
I guess I'll jump in here then, and thanks you guys. Those were great answers. I think that what's really interesting to me, seeing all of these works together, is this kind of way that each of them disrupts certain kinds of systems. And I think that that's one of the things that I find that my work ends up doing. I often stumble into a lot of my work, I have to say, honestly, so that, I will start a process and then end up sort of trying to follow it up by thinking I want to do something that's kind of impossible. This thing of recording ultrasonic laughter from rats is kind of an impossible dream. And at the time when I started it, literally 10 years ago, a lot of the technology didn't exist, or it existed, but it existed in a very high level. So I was working with engineers and things, but now the engineer I worked with was making his own bat detectors and ultrasonic microphones. And so, like really low tech, in a way that was really inexpensive and portable. And these things really, changed over time. So I think that one of the strategies I'm interested in is trying to reveal things that are kind of hidden to us and that we don't think of, and also to think about working with these kinds of creatures or cells or populations that are unnoticed, and kind of gone invisible. And so we need to sort of, bring them back out. Literally invisible, like we cannot hear this range of audio from this ultrasonics of the rat laughter, but then also, other projects I've done which have looked at different things like that. I love the notion that you brought up, Joel, of sort of stripping out value per se of things. I think it's bringing another kind of value to all of these situations, and I really appreciate how all of these works do this. And I also find that one strategy I use quite often, again, is play, but also something about the ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to be doing this project of trying to record rat laughter, for over 10 years. So that's something that I think also the ridiculousness of that work on my part, or that effort, brings light to certain things that we don't really often always pay attention to. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of the absurd running through all of the pieces. And yeah, and in the project that I presented in kind of a performative way, which is sort of a teaser for the performance on Saturday. Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking about capitalist production and, what if you throw a wrench into the system and literally, an aphrodisiac, and then how are people supposed to be productive? And so I think that in thinking about these streamlined systems and efficiency, that it just kind of creates like everything goes totally awry. Maybe I see that there was a question in the audience early on that I could jump to, and this was from Erin Gee, and she was, just since we've been talking about the different strategies, and she asks, curious about the use of the background music. This is in Antonia's. Was it selected to give a certain playfulness to the gestures, to imitate a club, to render the strangeness of the image more familiar through familiar music? Is it sarcastic or sincere? So many questions. And I know you mentioned a little bit about not being sarcastic or kind of playing with that idea, Antonia.
Yeah, the background is it comes from like a series of recording of the people performing on Tarot Bait that I reuse, most of them, especially like when there's like I really like the quality that like the compression over compression over compression, that there's something that I really like, the how like become like some kind of material. But the music like Prince and things like that were more like about like actually producing a show and like enjoying that. And but I really like the idea like tying up with what you, Stephanie, and Kathy were saying about like the absurd. I think there's like such an interesting capacity or potential in the absurd, in the disruption and the like thing, and seeing things from another perspective, which in my case was like literal with a change in scale, but also kind of like trying to be serious in that context, which renders more absurd. And I was thinking like, sorry for jumping over, but like about like Kathy's work with the laughter, about like tickling, how like it's not necessarily like something like pleasurable. So like there is laughter, but there's love, but you don't really know that what kind of reaction is that. And I think that's pretty interesting in terms of like disruption and eroticism and playfulness. Like, is this really about pleasure, or is just like this thing, right?
Yeah, I just so appreciate your bringing that point up, because when we were analyzing the files from these the ones that they had done in the lab, we didn't do them, but the ones that had been sent to us, we found that there was some other signals in there at different frequencies, and some of them might have been like stress signals. So we're still unpacking this very question that you just asked, Antonia, of is this really pleasurable, or is it there's a kind of stress behind it, you know? So I think you've hit on something that's all of these things that we're doing have these kinds of two sides to them. They have a pull from something that's really evident, being like, oh, this is pleasurable, and then there's also a kind of tension behind them, I think, in each of our works cases. So it's thanks for bringing that up.
We can also jump to a question that also relates to your piece, Kathy, from Amy Young's, that says, so interesting how laughter is playing out as gentle disruptions for serious topics. Are there examples of ways the audiences for these projects have been able to have vulnerable conversations that might not have been possible without laughter first?
Amy, great question. I think we could all be answering this one, including yourself. Yeah, I think well, the thing that's quite interesting in terms of how this might work is the ways that people are entangled with their rats. And this is either scientists, rat fanciers, who are people who have pet rats, or other people. There's such a sense of care there that it's palpable. And so when they start you know, to get a rat to laugh, they have to be kind of like relaxed in some way. Yes, there's stress, but there's got to be some kind of, you know, pleasure, like play principle there. And so there was a lot of giggling on our parts. You're right. I mean, we laughed quite a bit as we were engaging in any of this field work that Michelle and I did together. And then also, I can't imagine that the scientists who collected these signals didn't. I worked with a scientist, it's Symbiotica, who was in Australia, who was really testing a lot of, it'd be interesting for Stephanie to have met him, testing a lot of MDA and LSD with rats to see if how they were reacting. And he was really into testing them for laughter too. So, you know, and he laughed a lot, you know, he was like a really fun guy to be around. So I just think that this is a shared thing. I mean, it's like I think it's contagious. And I think that art has that kind of effect, or affect, I guess I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you guys want to answer that question too.
Well, in I'm Chilean, and in my country we address difficult topics through jokes. That's the way to, well, a lot of countries, but like it's very difficult to like at the same time people can be like they're not straightforward. The way to be straightforward is to say like a joke, so you kind of like anticipate the discomfort, like, and produce that, so it's kind of the discomfort of that truth is contained in the affective response, so you are kind of like and in between there was like a uncomfortable truth.
I mean, I will say I don't have very much laughter in this work per se. We had a lot of laughs when we were setting off, when we were releasing the balloon. There were a couple of kids around that just came over and had a lot of fun with it. But definitely, I think there's a humor and a kind of destabilizing of like a normative kind of baseline emotion, true things like humor and absurdity that runs through this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think pretty much all of my work tends to be pretty absurd and humorous. Except for that robotic garden was actually, well, one of them was very serious, and I was like, wow, that's kind of serious. But I used to do a lot of more game-based work, and so, and when I work with students, I always feel like if you are dealing with more sensitive topics, that I never want to be didactic, and I want to make things, I want to, like everybody's been saying, to relax people and make them feel more comfortable and create things that are more playful. And then I think people are more able to get into conversations about these more sensitive topics. So it looks like we have a couple of questions that I could jump to. This is one from Laura for Antonia. It says, you mentioned something very interesting about your approach that is inclined in disruption and contamination with play. And I'm wondering, what is audience? What are the different contexts and platforms of diffusion? I'm curious to know more about this idea of disruption and contamination and how you see that it's being acted.
I'm not sure if I understand completely the question, but maybe we can talk together about like contamination, because I think it's something that all of us are addressing in some way, like in this idea of disruption and contamination, and being like produce instance of encounter vulnerability, things that happen, right? Like with your balloon, for example, Joel, and how what happened like in another height, or the kind of new encounters, and even like the contamination, or even like the lack of oxygen, for example. Like you can, maybe it's not exactly contamination, but, or when you approach well, obviously the aphrodisia is such a contamination, or like you are like vulnerable, or when if you hear like a rat laughing, and I think it's about producing moments that, not sure if are not structured, but at least you take a moment to put a structure on, so that there's like this disturbance that are so productive, not in a capitalistic sense, but like something that we can use in unexpected ways. So I think that is something that I'm very interested, and I think is something that could be all of us could elaborate on something like that.
Do you want to go with that, Joel? Because I'm just thinking about it is really, in terms of contamination, really relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think air pollution was and still is, a total major concern. So, a lot, again, about the extraction of values, about removing these contaminants like lock, stock, and smoke and barrel. Who cares what's out there? We just want it to be clean and pure. But then, thinking about the ways that you can generate different sensorial experiences from this process of kind of getting up into the atmosphere. It's definitely one of the ways that you disrupt those kinds of technocratic solutions. But then another thing is also to start thinking about whatever is in there, and trying to reread what's in the atmosphere as not a contaminant, not per se, but as a store, like some kind of a database that you can then read in a certain way through a different lens.
I think that for me, that some of the disruption comes with this project that I talked about, with the idea of giving animals a kind of agency to, actually, maybe even slightly change their situation, which is going to be difficult if they're lab animals. But, to have this kind of opportunity to, what I had envisioned, which is really anthropomorphic, I know, but to have this kind of contagion happen. And there haven't been a huge amount of studies of, for example, playing rat laughter or mouse laughter back to rats or mice. But I imagine this kind of energy that could come from, and this is just my own projection, but could come from this kind of state that rats or mice take on in a laboratory, and then gain a kind of fearlessness to really disrupt the scene there, and just start having dance parties and all of this stuff. So that's the kind of disruption that I'm thinking of and going for with this one. And I think it operates differently in different projects, but that's it, I think, for me. Animal Revolution, Ron Briglio's Animal Revolution comes to mind.
But I mean, it's also interesting to think about these contaminants, and I think this was also mentioned in that instead of creating like a negative state, right, they end up creating maybe something that can be considered a more positive state. I don't want to say, well, okay, so I'm thinking of the example with the soil in this other project that I did, Proof of Soil, and that the contaminants by, like in microbial fuel cells, produce power or electricity, which is kind of more useful, positive thing. In the, you think about, I guess in the oyster example, that how does this kind of cyborg oyster elixir going to affect a person, and there's going to be many different outcomes. And then, of course, I was just thinking about, I don't want to say his name, but Trump, and his steroids that he just took that made him incredibly high, and he thinks how that has affected him mentally. I don't know if that's a good example, but I think you kind of get what I'm going on. That there's many multiple outcomes in something that's a contaminant. It's hard to predict what actually might happen. I'm trying to look at these other questions, or if anyone else has any other thoughts on that. I was trying to get Adam to elaborate on his question. I didn't quite understand it about humor and satire is fun. This was, I guess, for Kathy, right? But all your projects are also disassociative in an amazing realignment moment potential. I don't know if does that make sense, Kathy?
Yeah, I don't know why I'm not seeing the questions, but yeah. Okay, so thank you, Adam. Nice to hear your voice. Yeah, I think there's a way, and again, I see that happening with all of these works that are in this particular, lineup from everybody here, that I think these works do a kind of shift, kind of like under you, like pulling the rug out from under you, in terms of, we're watching this dollhouse of Antonia's in a sex chat room. I mean, it's like absurd and wonderful that that's the scenario there, and there's like floor cleaning going on as the sex act, and this is like with this magic, giant glove. So there's a way that these works, even in just the presentations today, had this kind of disruption or dislocation, I guess is the word you're using, and reshifting the way we think about them. Certainly Joel's height, I love that image of watching us from the balloon, or watching the ground from the balloon, and how these things begin to kind of like flip around our perspectives. So I don't know that I'm answering your question, so chime in if there's something else I should be pointing it at, but I'll just pass it on to everybody else, because I think you all have lots to say about that.
I mean, I think another thing that came up that maybe could segue into this is something you said, Joel, at one point. I don't know, I've been watching the video presentations and seeing you presenting, because Joel Long is everywhere. Is this your fourth panel today, Joel? Yeah. So I'm going to keep directing questions to Joel. Let's all the audience.
Watch
Joel's fourth panel.
He knows everything.
Yeah, he's got two small kids. Let's just keep it going. But I'm just thinking, going back to Audrey Lorde and the way that she thinks about the erotic and its relationship to sentience. And you talk about these sensorial frameworks, and all of the works create sensorial frameworks, right? In all of these works, there's these different ways of communicating that are not the normative ways of either human to human or human to non-human. And I'd be curious to hear about these frameworks inform and what kind of agency or empowerment you see emanating from them, and in these other forms, of communication that are not based on just like human language.
Yeah, I want to, I think one of the greatest, I guess, anecdotes that inspired me in this project was, do I have it here somewhere? Again, with Zoom, it's like you're this close to everything that you want to talk about, right? That's amazing. But like Peter Sloterdijk, in, I think it's Bubbles, he starts talking about this amazing moment where a kid kind of blows a
bubble out, and as he looks at that bubble gently waft into the sky, he's taken up in it. His entire consciousness is in that balloon, essentially. And then he goes up and up and up, and then it ruptures, right? And at that moment of rupture, you realize that there was some kind of a transcendence and a dissociation of the self. And I think I've been really inspired by that kind of teleportation of the self into something that you're looking in the sky. So the balloon thing, which again, like I want to bring the image of the Fellini's 8.5 in the opening segment as this. He's sitting in the psychologist's chair, but then the metaphor is, he's basically a balloon flying in there, and then the psychiatrist is like, come down, and then he gets pulled down. And that idea that if we can translocate ourselves like into that atmosphere, right? I mean, one of the sensorial challenges that we'll face, obviously vertigo is one, like, this, like what we think is calm and pristine is obviously turbulence. And at, like certain times of the day, this can be something that's very, very destabilizing and potentially very, very uncomfortable. And so what I'm trying to think about, right, is to be able to live with that discomfort, to see discomfort not as the opposite of comfortable, or like pain not as the opposite of pleasure, but as some kind of a continuum that will allow us, I think, to continue looking at, like at discomfort as a way of understanding our environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I always feel like I have to laugh at the end of it.
You could.
What about Antonia, just in terms of the sort of play communication that is happening in the Chatterbot, and the way that you interpret it through this representation of the dollhouse? And I just kind of keep coming back to how you say in the beginning of the presentation that people do this voluntarily. If they get paid, that's great, but that it does sort of defy what these online sex websites are meant to do. But just in terms of thinking of more the agential and empowerment through, there is the chat communication, but we're really getting a sense of what's going on, this different sensorial framework, by this arm that comes in and it's doing these different things, but there are these cues, and there's this gesturing that happens. It's a foreplay, right? It's a kind of foreplay that's happening in these like little miniature rooms. So maybe, I don't know, you could expand on that a little bit more.
Well, there's a lot, but I'm gonna keep it short. When I start looking at these sex camps, it was like way more amateur than it is right now, which is pretty interesting, because in the meantime of like in the 4 years of observation, everything changed in, like, not only this platform, but in this platform is very clear this transition from like this kind of like amateur framework to very the more like professional one. But this thing about like so that at the beginning, and that was what inspired the project, this domestic paradigm was more important. So people were kind of like see if they can receive money while they're doing like some domestic activities, and like stretching the performance into everyday life. So the kind of like the narrative arc start to be kind of very like this, right? Like not too much like dramatic tension. So the everyday start like leaking or like filtering or like inundating these things. So that was very interesting, and I really want to stress that quality, and and people had to, because like all this gender aspect of like that you don't work at home, so like nobody was like pretending that they were working, but they were working all the time. So that kind of thing for me was like inspiring to play with, literally, to stress this work as play and play as work. So yeah.
And with Kathy and knowing the history of your work and other, you've been engaging with animals for a long time in terms of communication, in all kinds of animals. And well, I know the cats and
Right.
cats and rats, they have to write, yeah. But yeah.
No, Kathy has a cat that is a filmmaker, right?
Yeah. Well, he's passed away, but he was, yes. I'm sure he's still making them, but yeah, I mean, I think, and this may be an old, challenge that, because it literally, I think I've been working on this for 20 years now, this idea of, interspecies communication. Is it possible? Can we ever do this? And I guess it's one way. When I first started working on these projects, like the project that Stephanie's talking about, and that you mentioned too, Antonia, is from a film called Animal Attraction, which is literally 20 years old. It's, mind-boggling. And at the time that I made that piece, I was working with an editor and also some other really close friends of mine who are really incredibly brilliant people, who said, if you put out this film about animal communication, and also the fact that the animals in it, or some of them are making films, well, actually I was their producer, you will be laughed out of the art world. And I just remember thinking, I don't know, let's try it. So it was a moment when animal studies were coming into play and people were interested in thinking about these things. And I think that a lot of the work I've done since then has been trying to break down these kinds of hierarchies of our thinking, which is still in play. We still fall into this this Cartesian trap of kind of like humans being at the top of the heap, as we all know. So that's what some of these projects have been about, is this kind of great equalizer. And so that's where I've been working for a long time. And I think that's what rat laughter tries to do. If rats can laugh, what else are they capable of in terms of these emotions that we consider just our own? But there's obviously a huge shared community of emotions that animals are now expressing, and we're getting much more research into that, and plants and other cells and other, this is going much deeper than just animals too. And Steph, your work does a lot of that too. I mean, I remember you working on this, through the dowsing that you did early on, and also getting into this project. This project is so interesting in terms of just presenting an aphrodisiac as a kind of, easily come by commodity. And how does it work? Like, what do oysters do for us? It's so great. I don't know, maybe you want to speak to this question of erotics and power in terms of that work too, because it's really interesting how you're sort of like looking into Pandora's box for me with this project.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is also looking at kind of the whole industry, like the self-help industry, and looking at the different directives. And I always do tend to take a more satirical tone, which I think that there's a lot of work out there now. A lot of the politics around self-care are more generative. Yeah, I mean, it just seems, that, like, especially now, this project, which I hope to do at some point, was going to be more of a physical installation, but it was going to be like a hookah lounge where everybody is kind of relaxed. And yeah, I mean, I'm just, curious, like using the language of can we cure climate change? And the problem is humans, and what the whole discourse, starting with Haraway, of becoming animal and becoming the oyster, and what might that look like? And in the panel just before, the conversation was about, like, we're trapped in these boxes, and thinking about, how can we kind of break through these boxes and have more intimate or some kind of tactile sensation. But yeah, it's still all just a work in progress, and I'm trying to see how I can work with this idea in these contained spaces, and maybe telematically. And I did think about initially teledildonics. Are they going to reemerge again?
Oh yeah.
Now that we're
huge
in this, yeah, or become more popular in the mainstream now, or maybe they are, and I'm just not aware of it. I don't know if I answered my own question, but
I was thinking, like, related to what Kathy was asking about your work, Stephanie, and also I think it's related to the work of the three of you. This idea, like, because I think we were talking a bit about, like, queering infrastructure, but also I think, especially in your project, Stephanie, yeah, and probably in Kathy's one, this idea of, like, creating infrastructures that are queer in a way. Like, is that, like, like in like, if we can think in the latter as not as infrastructure, but like what would happen if that thing create some kind of a structure, would be a queer infrastructure. I think it's more clear. It's more clear in the case of Stephanie, because, like, yeah, what would happen if this is like an infrastructure, would still be queer. I think there is a tension that maybe we could explore.
I mean, I think, Steph, the thing that's interesting, and I like what you were saying, Antonia, because the takeaway from the Audrey Lorde article, which I really loved, referring to that, thinking about this, was the kind of power that are assigned to erotics, and particularly women's erotics. So I think that it's really interesting then to think about just distributing that power. Like, here, have some aphrodisiac. You can have this power instantly, and so you've made this opportunity. And in some ways, each of these pieces do. Like, I get high, off of those atmospheric thoughts of Joel's too. I mean, I'm just like, all of us are sort of bringing in this kind of idea of the erotics of power, I think, and the power of erotics, I guess. I mean, so I don't know if you want to riff off of that.
well, I mean, it does make me think about the gaze and the way of just viewing, right, triggers physical sensations. And we're talking about actually ingesting things, but are they triggered in different ways? And is that what is really going to happen now, because we are in these, in these boxes, and everything at the moment is determined by vision and sight. And I know there's been a lot of research done about that. But yeah, definitely in what Antonia was saying, that I am trying to create this other kind of capitalist system of sort of queering the more industrial aquacultural system, and sort of playing, with ecosystem services and questioning all of that, so that, right, we become the natural capital, that we're not just using it for pleasure, but we are. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think there's also something to be said about fetishizing something that's unattainable. maybe ultrasound today is becoming more and more mainstream. Like people know that there are devices like this, but definitely, I mean, thinking about accessing a hidden language and a hidden possible pleasure is something that that might be really thinking about those kinds of power relationships. Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, when Kathy was at Symbiotica, I actually was a student there as well. So, it was really cool. But there was a project that I was working on, but I was really inspired by the story of this doctor who had spent years listening to a stethoscope, and it was always about this utilitarian, function. But then at some point, he just started getting really he just started loving the sound so much that he would hire prostitutes to his house, and then he would just listen to the sound of their heartbeats. And it was that kind of intimacy, but the opening of the body as well, queering maybe that language, and I thought it was really, really poetic.
Well, we're almost at the conclusion of our event, of our panel. We have like 5 more minutes, but there is a lovely comment about teledildonics and a link, hacking teledildonics. But any closing thoughts? Anything anyone wants to add before we have a cocktail? And some oysters.
You were saying, Kathy, I saw you.
No, I was just thinking, and this is so lame, but I was just thinking that, and we talked about this when we were in a little pre-huddle before the panel about how, we do miss the ability to all go out and have a drink together and those oysters and do it physically. So this idea of trying to break down this mode we're in at this moment is really a good one to focus on right now. So any strategies anybody out there and you all have about how to get out of our little boxes here, let's shout them out. We should have, group dances, lots of good sounds. I think the sound idea is like we probably need all really good soundscapes to every panel we ever do again. We'll just,
I would want to come into a Zoom conversation with like a, WWE kind of backing track.
Yeah.
Let the bodies hit the floor.
Yeah. Perfect.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great. It's been great.
Thank you, panelists. You've been really great.
Yeah, all of you.